The name Iran echoes daily in world headlines, evoking images of complex conflicts, secret alliances, and a troubling nuclear race. But beyond modern geopolitics, there exists a far more ancient narrative, a story already etched into the most read text in human history, the Bible. Within its sacred pages, the destiny of Iran, from its genesis to its role in apocalyptic prophecies, was revealed. We won't find it under its current name, but by its ancestral designation, Persia. The Bible not only documents the birth of this nation, but also anticipates its role in the dreaded war of Gog and Magog, a colossal alliance of nations that will rise against Israel in the final days. However, the divine plot is infinitely more complex, because before becoming a prophetic adversary, the Persian Empire was the instrument chosen by God for a mission of liberation. It was Persia that received the divine commission to free his people, finance the reconstruction of their sacred temple, and bring to life the astonishing visions of the prophet Daniel. Brace yourself, because what you are about to discover is a truth that few dare to teach, the exact role of Iran in God's master plan, from the beginning of time until the end. Our journey begins in the book of Genesis, just after the great flood that purified the earth. God offered humanity a new dawn through Noah and his family, the sole survivors. His three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the patriarchs of all the nations that would populate the world. It is in chapter 10 of Genesis that we find the primordial genealogical map, a record detailing how the peoples were distributed across the face of the earth. And it is here that the two founders of the lineage that would one day form the mighty Persian Empire are named: Madai and Elam. Madai, son of Japheth, was the ancestor of the Medes, a warlike people who settled in the mountainous regions of the north in the territory that is now part of Iran. From those peaks, the descendants of Madai, organized into independent clans and tribes, forged a resilient and tenacious character, becoming the heart of ancient northern Iran. In parallel, Elam, son of Shem, gave rise to the Elamites, who settled in the fertile plains of the southwest, near the Persian Gulf. But the story of Elam in the Bible begins with an act of aggression. In Genesis 14, the first great international war is recounted, where Chedorlaomer, king of the Elamites, leads a coalition of 4 eastern kings to invade Canaan. They plundered cities, subjugated entire peoples, and captured Lot, Abraham's nephew. This shows that Elam was not a simple tribe, but a considerable military power, and according to the scriptures, it was the first nation to directly attack those close to the people of faith. But Abraham, moved by an unshakable faith, did not cower. With only 318 of his servants, he launched a daring pursuit, attacked the enemy camp during the night, and achieved a victory that defied all human logic. He rescued Lot, freed all the captives, and humiliated the powerful coalition of eastern kings. That impossible triumph left a celestial message engraved: no earthly power can prevail against those who walk under the protection of God. Despite this defeat, the people of Elam persisted. Centuries passed, and both the Elamites in their plains and the Medes in their mountains grew in number and strength. While the great empires of the era rose and fell, a new power was quietly taking shape in ancient eastern Mesopotamia, unifying these two peoples. First, they were clans, then kingdoms, and finally, an empire destined to change history, the Persian Empire. And although in their beginnings they were pagan nations, they were never outside of God's sovereign plan. Long before their rise, the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah had pronounced divine judgments upon them. Isaiah prophesied that God would use Elam and Media as a hammer to judge and destroy arrogant Babylon, the same empire that had razed Jerusalem and desecrated the temple. The punishment for Babylon was already decreed, and its executioners would be the united peoples of Iran. But The second prophecy was even more stunning. God would not only use Persia to punish, but also to redeem.
Isaiah announced that a future Persian king, a pagan king who had not even been born, would be God's anointed to free the Israelites from captivity and order the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the prophet named him more than 150
years in advance, Cyrus. And both prophecies, that of judgment and that of redemption, began to be fulfilled with supernatural accuracy. During the 7th century before Christ, the first monarch of the Medes, Deioces, managed to unify the scattered tribes of Elam and Madai, establishing the first imperial capital on Iranian soil, Ecbatana. It would be his grandson, Cyrus, who would take the next decisive step, transforming his army into an unstoppable war machine designed for a single purpose: to annihilate Nineveh, the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire, one of Israel's worst enemies. The prophecy was in motion. God was raising Persia from its foundations as an agent of judgment and, at the same time, of future redemption. But while Persia grew stronger, its destiny had already been revealed in visions to a young Hebrew captive in the heart of the enemy empire, Daniel. It had all begun when the Babylonian army, under the command of King Nebuchadnezzar, razed Jerusalem. The walls were torn down, the sacred temple was plundered, and thousands of people, including a teenager named Daniel, were torn from their homes and taken as slaves to the opulent court of Babylon, the most powerful empire on earth. However, amidst the darkness and moral decay of the palace, Daniel remained pure, and for that unwavering faithfulness, God granted him an extraordinary gift: the ability to receive and interpret visions that revealed not just the immediate future, but the entire course of human history. From the heart of the empire that had destroyed his nation, Daniel began to see how God was preparing the rise of another empire, one destined to replace Babylon and play a crucial role in the fate of Israel. The Empire of Persia. The announcement came through a dream that tormented King Nebuchadnezzar. A colossal statue of terrifying splendor stood before him, forged from different metals. Terrified, the king demanded his wise men not only interpret the dream, but first describe it to him without having heard it, a task impossible for any mortal. But Daniel, prepared by God, was brought before the monarch. With an authority that was not his own, he revealed the mystery. "You, O king, are that head of gold, but after you another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours, represented by the chest and arms of silver." That silver figure was not a single entity, but two arms, two powers intertwined in one body, the Medes and the Persians. They were united, but they were not equal, for the Persian arm would rise with more strength and assume total control. The prophecy was unequivocal. The throne of Babylon would pass to a new empire chosen by God, and the king announced by Isaiah centuries before was about to burst onto the scene of history. His name was Cyrus. This young Persian king first conquered Media, merging both kingdoms into the formidable Medo-Persian Empire, and with a relentless expansion, he became the greatest power of his era, until he finally set his sights on the impregnable Babylon. The prophesied night arrived in an unexpected way. Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, was holding a lavish banquet with 1,000 of his nobles. In an act of arrogance and sacrilege, he ordered the sacred vessels stolen from the Temple of Jerusalem to be brought so they could toast with them in honor of their pagan idols. At that very moment, the fingers of a hand appeared and wrote 4 enigmatic words on the palace wall: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Terror seized the king. No one could decipher the message until Daniel was summoned. With a solemn calm, he revealed the divine verdict. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. While Daniel was still speaking, the prophecy was silently materializing. The armies of Cyrus the Great had managed to divert the waters of the Euphrates River, infiltrating the city through the dry riverbed. The city gates were open, as if God himself had unlocked them. That same night, Belshazzar was assassinated, and Babylon, the great power that had oppressed the world, fell to Persia. For the Jews, who for 70 years had lamented their exile, the impossible became reality. A pagan king, Cyrus, not only decreed their freedom to return to Jerusalem, but also financed the reconstruction of the temple. He sent the leaders Zerubbabel, of the royal line of David, and Joshua, the high priest, with full imperial backing to lay the new foundations. In this way, Persia became the only nation of antiquity that, instead of destroying Israel, acted as its restorer, thus fulfilling God's extraordinary plan. But God had granted Daniel another vision about Persia, an even more awe-inspiring and symbolic image. In this revelation, Daniel saw 4 terrifying beasts emerging from the Great Sea of humanity, each representing an empire. The second beast was a gigantic bear, raised up on one side, with 3 ribs brutally clenched between its teeth, and a heavenly voice thundered from the sky, commanding it, "Arise, devour much flesh." This bear was the prophetic representation of the empire that would succeed Babylon, the alliance of Media and Persia. The vision was of astonishing precision. The bear was raised on one side, a perfect metaphor for how Persia, although it united with Media, would end up completely dominating the alliance. The 3 ribs in its mouth symbolized its 3 most formidable conquests, the 3 pillars of its imperial expansion, the kingdom of Lydia, the immense Babylon, and ancient Egypt. One by one, these nations would be swallowed by its unstoppable advance. And history confirmed this vision with chilling accuracy. After having subjugated Lydia, in Asia Minor and Babylon itself, Persia's appetite did not stop. Under the reign of Cambyses II, Cyrus's son and successor, the Persian armies marched across the unforgiving Sinai Desert to confront Pharaoh Psamtik III in the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt, which had once been Israel's oppressor, fell to the power of the Persian Empire, and thus the 3rd rib was torn out, fulfilling the divine design. Years later, while praying on the banks of the Ulai River, Daniel was swept up in another vision, this time more specific, clearer, and more detailed in its description of Persian power. Before his eyes appeared an imposing ram that had 2 horns. However, one of the horns was visibly higher than the other, and the higher one had grown in later. This ram charged with unstoppable fury to the west, to the north, and to the south, and no beast could stand before it, nor could anyone stop its advance. Then, a heavenly voice explained the meaning. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Once again, Persia was the protagonist of the divine drama, but no longer just as a liberator, but as a conquering empire, an unleashed beast that charged without opposition. The detail of the higher horn was another exact allusion to the Persian supremacy over the Medes, 2 peoples, 1 empire, but a single dominant throne. However, the vision continued, and suddenly, emerging from the west, a male goat appeared, moving with the speed of the wind, almost without touching the ground, and it had a single notable horn between its eyes. In a moment of lightning-fast violence, it charged the powerful ram, knocked it down, and trampled it without anyone being able to rescue it. It was the prophecy of Persia's end. The next empire, Greece, led by the figure of Alexander the Great, would defeat the Persian colossus with supernatural speed. At that moment, Daniel could not have known the names, but he saw clearly that Persia, the most vast and glorious empire the world had ever known, would also have its end. But that end was still far on the horizon. In its days of greatest splendor, Persia was not only invincible, it was the center of the known universe. Its dominion stretched from the borders of India to Ethiopia, and it was in the days of King Ahasuerus that the throne of the greatest empire on earth was established in the majestic citadel of Susa, in the heart of Elam, what is today southwestern Iran. And it was precisely there, in Susa, that Persia's history would become intertwined with one of the most unexpected miracles of the Bible, proving that the fate of the great empire could be influenced by a single woman. King Ahasuerus held an extravagant banquet that lasted 6 months to flaunt his power, followed by a 7-day feast for all the inhabitants of Susa. In a fit of pride, he ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to present herself to display her beauty before his guests. But the queen refused, and the king, publicly humiliated, banished her on the advice of his counselors. To replace her, they proposed a radical solution: to search throughout the kingdom for the most beautiful young virgins, to be brought to the palace harem. After a year of preparation, they would be presented to the king. Among these young women was a Jewish orphan named Hadassah, though no one knew her by that name. She had been raised in secret by her cousin Mordecai, and upon entering the palace, received a new name: Esther. Against all odds, Esther found favor in the king's eyes, and without anyone knowing of her Jewish lineage, Ahasuerus crowned her as the new queen of Persia. But as Esther ascended to the throne, a deadly shadow loomed over her people. A man named Haman, a descendant of the Amalekites, the ancestral enemy of Israel, was elevated by the king to the highest position in the empire. It was decreed that everyone should bow before him. But Mordecai, faithful to his God, refused. Wounded in his pride, the vengeful Haman did not want to punish only Mordecai, but plotted a genocide. He convinced King Ahasuerus with lies, accusing a different people scattered throughout the kingdom of not obeying the laws, and proposed to exterminate them all. The king, deceived, sealed a decree of death with his ring. On a determined date, all the Jews of the Persian Empire, men, women, and children, were to be annihilated. Terror gripped the Jewish communities. Mordecai sent a desperate message to Esther, warning her that she too was in danger. To save her people, she had to do the unthinkable: present herself before the king without being summoned, an act punishable by immediate death unless the king extended his golden scepter as a sign of pardon. Finally, armed with a faith that transcended the fear of death, Esther decided to risk her life for her people. She appeared before the king without being summoned, and God granted her grace in his eyes. The golden scepter was extended, but Esther, with a heavenly wisdom, did not reveal her request immediately. She knew the moment had to be perfect. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet, and then to a second banquet the next day. It was there, in the intimacy of the second dinner, that the queen unleashed the truth like a sharp sword. If we had only been sold as slaves, I would have kept silent, but our extermination has been decreed, that of my people and myself. The king, astonished, stood up and asked with fury, "Who is he who has dared to conceive such a thing?" And Esther, pointing to the man dining with them, declared, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." The king's face transformed with rage. Haman, terrified, fell to his knees begging for his life, but his fate was already sealed. By order of the king, he was hanged on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. However, the danger had not disappeared. The edict of death was still in effect, and according to the immutable law of Media and Persia, a royal decree could not be revoked. So Esther and Mordecai proposed a bold solution, a new decree. The king signed and sealed it, granting the Jews in all the provinces of the empire the right to assemble, arm themselves, and defend their lives. The day that was meant to be their annihilation became the day of their greatest victory. And so, The Persian Empire, which was on the verge of being their tomb, was transformed into their refuge, their throne, and their shield. After this miracle, Persia seems to vanish from the main stage of the scriptures. Centuries passed, Rome rose to power, but Persia's silence did not mean its absence from the divine plan. Centuries later, as the world awaited the arrival of the Messiah, Persia reappeared in a spectacular way in the Gospel of Matthew. The text recounts that wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Who exactly were these wise men? The Greek word magoi refers to a caste of wise men, astronomers, and priests from the east. All historical evidence points to them coming from the ancient lands of the Medo-Persian Empire, the region we now know as Iran. These men were not kings, but they were part of an incredibly influential religious and intellectual elite, custodians of ancestral knowledge and prophecies. It is very likely that among the scrolls they studied with devotion were the writings of the prophet Daniel, who had served in the courts of Babylon and Persia centuries earlier. Daniel had not only interpreted dreams, but had prophesied the coming of the Messiah with mathematical precision, establishing a divine timeline. When these magi saw the star, an unmistakable celestial sign, they knew the time had been fulfilled. They left everything behind, crossed deserts, and arrived in Bethlehem with 3 gifts of profound prophetic meaning: gold, to acknowledge his royalty; incense, to honor his divinity; and myrrh, to anticipate his future sacrifice. Without knowing it, the wise men of Persia proclaimed the greatest mystery of the universe, that this child was king, was God, and was the sacrificial lamb. While the scholars of Jerusalem slept and King Herod plotted murder, it was the men of Iran who were the first to recognize and worship the Savior. But the biblical story of Iran does not conclude at the manger in Bethlehem. Just as it was an instrument of redemption, it is also destined to be part of one of the darkest chapters of the prophetic future. God not only revealed its beginning, but also its role in the end, through the prophet Ezekiel, in the dreaded vision of the war of Gog and Magog. In chapter 38, Ezekiel describes a vast coalition of nations that in the last days will rise up against a restored Israel. And the word of God is direct: "Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, and prophesy against him. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them." Persia, modern-day Iran, is one of the first nations mentioned in this final alliance. The same nation that once helped rebuild the temple will now join a military assault against the people of God. The other allies include Gog, a leader from the far north, often associated with Russia; Cush, Sudan; Put, Libya, and other peoples from the region of Turkey. Together they will advance like a storm to cover the land of Israel. But this attack will not succeed. It will provoke the direct and furious intervention of God. Earthquakes, fire, and confusion will destroy the invading army, and the glory of God will be manifested before all nations. Persia, as part of that coalition, will be judged. However, herein lies the greatest paradox. The prophet Jeremiah, centuries earlier, had already announced a dual destiny for Elam, the heart of ancient Persia. First, a judgment. "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might." But then, an astonishing promise. "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord." This passage changes everything. Although Iran will rise against Israel at the end of times, its story does not end in destruction. God, even in the midst of judgment, leaves the door open for redemption and restoration. The biblical story of Persia is therefore a mirror of humanity itself, created, redeemed, fallen, judged, and finally restored by grace. For this reason, the final destiny of Iran is a warning to all powers that defy God, but also a promise of hope, because it is written that in the final days, the surviving nations will go up to Jerusalem to worship the King. Perhaps among those nations there will be a restored Iran, a final witness to the glory of God. And now I ask you, do you believe that Iran is fulfilling its prophetic role today? Do you see the signs of these ancient prophecies in today's headlines? Leave your opinion in the comments.